Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord, and this time I'll be covering chapters 23 through 27 of Genesis. In chapter 24, verse 3, Isaac is told to marry within the covenant. I think this is pretty significant. Some people seem to think that the children of Israel were very selective in whom they should marry and that they should keep to themselves for ethnic reasons or something, but I think it's pretty obvious from Genesis that it's all about maintaining the gospel and the understanding and passing that along down to children of Israel's kids, proper worship of the Lord. And we see in verses 6 through 7, Isaac is told not to leave the promised land, again, to stay in the place where God has said that he will bless everyone and bless them with immense blessings promised to Abraham. In verses 10 through 12, I think it's really significant that there are 10 camels that the servant is taking. 10 camels is a lot of camels. I've never watered a camel, but I've seen one and they are big and I would assume they can drink a ton of water. I think it's also significant in verses 17 through 19 that Rebecca volunteers. She shows up and the servant doesn't even ask Rebecca, "Hey, can you water my camels?" She's just like, "Hey, can I water your camels?" Which is cool, for one, because it's an immediate answer to prayer. The servant asked a sign from the Lord. He said, "Hey, I don't really know how this is going to happen, so if you could make this happen, I will treat it as a sign." And I think it's cool because God reveals himself differently to different people according to their language and understanding. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's somebody was in a tough spot and they said, "Hey, I really need an answer. Can you give me this so I can know?" And so that's what the Lord did. I think it's also cool in verses 54 through 58 that Rebecca had a single night to sleep on it after the servant came and told her all about Isaac and everything. And in the morning she said, "Yeah, I'll go. I'll leave my family. I'll go with a next to complete stranger." And I think this is really cool and indicative of Rebecca's faith and reflective of the faith you have in making covenants with the Lord. You don't necessarily know all the details when you promise to make a covenant with the Lord or when you set out to make a covenant with the Lord, but you have the faith that it is the right thing to do and that it will be the best thing for you. Jumping over to chapter 25, verses 1 through 5, I think it's interesting that Abraham had 12 other kids, but he ultimately gave his blessing and birthright to Isaac, and that's who it was promised that all the blessings would come through. Verse 8, it talks about how Abraham was gathered to his people when he died. I think it's a cool indication of a belief in the afterlife and a continuation after death. In verse 27, I think it's interesting that Isaac is referred to as a plain man. And if you look at the footnote, it talks about how in Hebrew it's a whole man, a complete man. It's not a derogatory term. As for the whole Jacob and Esau pottage birthright thing in verses 28 through 34, I thought these two paragraphs from the Institute Manual were really spot on. It says the rationalization seems to reflect more scorn than hunger. Jacob would almost certainly have succored Esau freely if his life were in jeopardy. The point of this account seems to be to primarily show how little value Esau placed on the birthright. His immediate bodily needs were more important to him than the rights of the covenant. Additional evidence of this attitude is Esau's marriage to Canaanite women, which broke the covenant line. The birthright itself should have been a treasured thing. The highly desirable birthright blessing is the right to the presidency or keys of the priesthood. So in chapter 26, Isaac is commanded not to go down into the land of Egypt, but to dwell in the promised land that is given him. And the Lord makes an oath with Isaac, which is really cool and very covenant-oriented. And later on in that chapter, Isaac and his servants dig wells, and the Lord covenants with Isaac. Again, it's a new personal promise, a new personal covenant with Isaac, not just a continuation of, "Oh, you'll get all the things I promised Abraham, your father." And Isaac builds another well and altar in that place. And this is in verses 19 through 25. And I think it's really significant because often associated with temples and covenants is the idea of wells of living water that Christ talks about when he visits the woman at the well in Samaria, and go figure, it's one of the wells that Jacob dug. Anyway, in verses 34 through 35, we see a manifestation of Esau selling his birthright, where he goes and he marries outside of the covenant someone who does not share his same beliefs and faith, and it's selling his birthright for a mess of pottage, or in this case, selling the idea and the assurances of his posterity by marrying someone who doesn't have the same faith in the Lord and won't promote those same good things. In chapter 27, it's interesting to see the words used describing Isaac blessing Jacob. In verse 7 of chapter 27, it talks about how Jacob will come before Isaac, and Isaac will bless thee before the Lord. Before the Lord, referring to the idea and the concept in the temple and the tabernacle, that you're in the Lord's presence, that you're doing these things before the Lord with the Lord as a witness. In verse 24, it's interesting that they establish names, and in verse 26, it's interesting that they embrace as they prepare for the words and the blessing to be given. Just interesting things. In verse 28, it talks about how the dew is one of the things contained in the blessing, and dew is heaven anointing the earth. So I think that's an interesting idea that the pouring out anointing is in there, that the fatness of the earth and corn and wine, these things are all reminiscent of temple sacrifices later. In verse 33, I think it's interesting that after Isaac has found out that he's been deceived, he says, yea, and he, referring to Jacob, shall be blessed. Even though Isaac was deceived and Jacob got his blessing deceptively, it seems like Isaac admits that the blessing he gave him was from God, that even though Isaac didn't realize who he was giving the blessing to, God knew who was getting the blessing, and God directed that blessing. So Isaac feels like it was a blessing properly pronounced upon the head of Jacob. I think it's also interesting in verse 46 that unlike Isaac, who wasn't supposed to leave the promised land, Jacob is forced to flee because of Esau, but he doesn't marry outside of the covenant like Esau. He puts it as a priority to go find someone who can help him carry on the covenant line and the belief in the Lord. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and hope to see you next time.